Okay, so in this presentation we're going to demonstrate PowerPivot. Now PowerPivot is a add-on to Excel 2010 or comes automatically with Excel 2013. So what I'm going to do here is use PowerPivot to demonstrate how we can, as a business user, bring in data from a number of different sources and model it together. So just to talk about PowerPivot briefly, PowerPivot is essentially a data modeling tool in the hands of business users. So where an IT developer, for example, would use something like SQL Server Integration Services or SSIS to bring data together from a number of different sources, a business user would use a tool like PowerPivot to do exactly the same thing. So the scenario for this demonstration is that as a business user, I would like to see if there's a connection between the number of funded counselling hours that a student receives and the corresponding absentee rate of that student. Now in this scenario, only one of those data sources is provided by the IT department, which is the number of absences, but the funded counselling hours is not provided by IT, but as a business user I have that myself within an Excel spreadsheet on my local machine. So using PowerPivot, I'm going to connect those two data sources together to create a data model for other users to then report on. So within Excel, I'm going to click on the PowerPivot tab and click on Manage, which will open up the PowerPivot window. And you'll notice at the top here I've got this area called Get External Data. So what I'm going to do is import my first data source now. So I'm going to say from database, from SQL Server. I'm just going to connect to my local database here, but this is simulating connecting to an IT data mart. At this point I can select from a list of tables or I can write a query. I'm just going to select from a list of tables here. I'm going to choose the absence fact table, the year, the school, and the absence type. If I want to, I can click on preview and filter. Okay, so I've chosen to filter this, and then I can simply say let's only choose the unexplained absences in this case, which will basically just reduce the amount of data coming into the PowerPivot model, which is important because all of the data coming in here is going to be compressed in memory. So PowerPivot is an in-memory tool. Okay, so I'll click on Finish, and that's going to bring in all of my tables there that I've chosen. Click on Close, and you'll see down the bottom here I can see a tab for each of the tables. Just to point out, this is read-only data now. I can't modify this. I can add extra columns just using Excel-like formulas, but I can't modify the data that has been imported. Now the reason that's good, A, because it's in memory, so it doesn't make sense for me to modify and write back to the source or anything like that. But secondly, it does remember the source of the data, which means that if I push this up to SharePoint, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the data that is in this model can be refreshed from the source. Which makes this a reusable solution moving forward, maintaining connections to the source of truth. So I can't modify the data as I mentioned, but what I can do is things like right click and say hide from client tools, which means that once a user reports on this model, they won't see that table there, dim absence type, which makes sense because we've filtered that down to a single absence type of unexplained. For the other tables though, what I'll do is rename them to be a bit more friendly. So we'll just take out the IT prefix there of dim and fact for dimensions and fact. And then we'll do things like hide the primary key columns. The users don't need to see that when they're reporting. They only need to see the descriptive columns, and we'll rename that to be a bit more clean. Similar thing with year. We'll call it year instead of year key. And on the absence table, we're going to hide all of the foreign keys. The only one we really need to see there is the absence count, which is the measure that we're interested in. And that's that done. Okay, so that's brought in our first source of data, which is from the IT department, which is the absence counts along with the dimensions for year and school, and the hidden one here for the absence type, which is limited to unexplained absences. Now, to complete our data model now, we need to bring in another source of data, which is the funded counselling hours. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't provided by IT, but as a business user, I have this on the desktop. So I'm just going to go up the top here and say from other sources. I'm going to choose Excel as the data source there, and I'm going to choose my local spreadsheet here, which is the funded counselling hours, and I'll say use first row as column headers. click next. Friendly name funded hours, which is the sheet name down the bottom there, is fine, so I'll click on finish, and that's going to bring in my data there. Fairly simple, it's just simply got the school name, the year, and the funded counselling hours. Now, because this is a separate set of data to the other 3 tables that came in, or 4 tables that came in, what I need to do is go over here to the diagram view and essentially connect these data sets together. So this is really the data modeling part here now. So I'm going to say the school name in the funded hours spreadsheet that I just brought in is the same as the school name in my database there, and year in the spreadsheet is the same as year in the database there. Now I only need to see year and school name once in the entities, so I'm going to right click on this one and say hide from client tools, and right click on year and say hide from client tools. Now, bearing in mind everything we're doing at this point is simply data modeling, we haven't done any reporting yet. That comes later with things like PowerView. This is purely data modeling that we're doing here now. So I'll leave it at this point. A fairly simple example there of PowerPivot, bringing in 2 different sets of data and then connecting them together using the diagram tools. So the next demonstration I'd like you to look at is PowerView, and that's where we'll use this data model that we've just created to actually report against and then deploy that to SharePoint.